to Weekly Unit 2. This is a lecture about the policy framework, including legislative, bureaucracy, and the public. The objectives for this week's weekly unit include a review of last week's unit concerning mental health systems, what composes mental health systems, and what are their components. We'll also take a look back at the relationships amongst those components of the system and their relationships both internally and externally to the system. And then we will expand the model that we developed last week and add to it to demonstrate various forms of oversight for mental health systems. So in the previous weekly unit, we looked at mental health systems. And we developed this model that consisted of 4 basic components. Those components included private practice, public systems, hospitals, and corrections. So each one of those components generally represents a set of mental health services that are provided to a particular population. Private practice being the most common for the self-insured, public systems being available for individuals who typically are more severely mentally ill or perhaps don't have access to private insurance. Typically, public systems are in what we call managed care, and managed care is essentially a form of an insurance company that oversees the public system and sets rates and manages costs and limits care according to a set of guidelines or algorithms. Most forms of public systems today are already managed care or will be moving to managed care by 2014 for healthcare reform. VA stands for Veterans Administration. People typically look at the Veterans Administration and the care that they provide as a true standalone public system, since it's specific to a population of veterans and is only available to them, and it is a complete standalone comprehensive public system. The third component are hospitals, and hospitals are further defined as local, acute, and state. Local hospitals, for example, being the prime example would be Enloe Hospital. An acute hospital in this instance means acute care or immediate care relative to psychiatric hospitalization. So this would typically be like a PUF, psychiatric holding facility. And then the third are state hospitals, and California is currently in the process of moving from a state department of mental health to a state department of state hospitals, and further defining the state hospital service specific to the mentally ill. AB 100 completely changed the formation of the Department of Mental Health and is changing it to be something less than what it is today, with a primary focus on state mental health institutions. And then the fourth one is corrections, very similar to the Veterans Administration in that there is typically care dedicated specifically to those who are incarcerated, and typically those forms of care or that system of care is traditionally separated or standalone compared to the other components. So when we look at this graphically, we have the 4 components that make up a basic mental health system, and those are visually depicted here. Now, we also talked about system relationships, and we identified 4 types of systems or groupings of those components that we identified in the model, and those were identified to us as the formal, lay, and folk systems, as well as human and social services. So the author Scheid, which, the author of the textbook that you have for this class, basically communicated to you in a recent chapter that components of mental health systems could be categorized or grouped. And when we talk about that, we're really talking about relationships. Okay, so we had the 4 basic components of a mental health system. And then now we're looking at that model from various groupings or categories according to perhaps, let's say, a population. And you'll recall that the lay system is typically made up of friends and family, individuals who may, for example, know about how to access a particular service, or it could be something as simple as a friend comforting an individual who is depressed. The folk system was identified as a category of religious folks, and I had used the example of the family priest, that typically, those individuals are called upon by members of the public for assistance, quite often because those members of the public don't know where else to turn. And so as a result, those religious individuals or alternative healing individuals begin to become a gateway to the rest of the system. And then likewise, the category of social services, where individuals are entering other types of programs, and upon entry into those programs, they're being identified with particular treatment needs, and as a result, they're being referred over to another part of the system for care. And typically the referral over to the other part of the system, that other part of the system we would refer to as the formal system. And you would recall that the formal system is primarily composed of primary care and specialty mental health. So those true, recognized, robust systems that are out there providing direct care to the community. So when you think about these categories, the categories of lay, folk, and social services then become a gateway or an entry point to the formal system. So let's graphically depict that. So we've got the 4 components that make up a simple mental health system, and then we impose those 4 categories that Scheid identified upon that system. So the light blue boxes across the bottom of your screen represent the system. The beige boxes across the top of your screen represent categories of that system and typically points of entry into those other boxes. So now let's begin to expand the model that we've created that should be very familiar to you now. And we're going to take all of those boxes that you saw and we're just going to encapsulate them into a single box called the mental health system. And then we're going to expand the model to create a bubble next to that box, and we're going to label that systems oversight or administration. And we'll graphically depict that in a minute. So what we're talking about now at this point is you've got this system out there that's operating. You have categories of the systems that represent relationships such as folk and lay and formal systems that interact with one another, become points of entry, points of referral, that type of thing. Now we're going to impose upon that an oversight structure, because the system needs to be managed, it needs to be contained, it needs to be directed, it needs to comply with regulations in law and policy. And so in order for that to happen, we have to create an oversight structure for the system in order to manage that. And typically there are 5 categories of that as identified in your reading for this week. And we can summarize that up as types of system oversight include government and administration. They include levels of government. So levels of government, for example, federal, state, and local. They include tools of government. So, for example, a budget is a tool of government, because if a legislative body only authorizes X number of dollars to provide a service, then that's all the funding that is available to provide that service, and it needs to be operated within the constraints of that budget allocation. So money becomes a tool of government. And then when government and its legislative oversight bodies fail the public, most states in our country allow direct democracy approaches. And when we talk about direct democracy, we're talking about legislative oversight has failed and the public has decided to take the decision making into their own hands. So, for example, a proposition in California is a form of direct democracy, because the proposition is an initiative that's been proposed by somebody. They went out and they collected signatures in order to qualify for the ballot. Then they got the question put onto the ballot and allow the public to vote for it. If the proposition passes, then it becomes law, absent legislative action. So it becomes a form of direct democracy. And then with the advent of Proposition 63 in the Mental Health Services Act, consumers, or the customers of care, have a big role today, unlike ever before, of being involved in systems oversight. In fact, Proposition 63 in the Mental Health Services Act actually encourages local organizations to incorporate consumers into the organization, both as employees and as decision makers. So one of the reading assignments for this weekly unit included Fessler Chapter 2, which is just a basic oversight of what government typically does. All of us have one perception or another about what it is that government actually does, and Fessler just kind of sums that up for us in a very general way so that we're approaching this topic in a unified format and kind of bringing those perceptions together. You know, and one of the things that Fessler identifies that remains very common today is what we see here under this first bullet that says reliance versus mistrust. And typically, government and its administration over programs and services kind of ebbs and flows depending on what it is that the public wants or needs versus what the public doesn't feel government is either providing well or has the capability to provide well, or perhaps has the public's interest at heart when providing that service. In fact, mistrust of government has extremely swelled over these last several years, as evidenced by the emergence of the Tea Party. The Tea Party is a party that has gained in acceptance by the public primarily around their philosophy about government. So typically you'll hear in the Tea Party platform that smaller government is better. And so the Tea Party strategy is to actually shrink government because they feel that government has become too involved in the lives of people and has overstepped their bounds. So that kind of reinforces this idea that Fessler presents to us, that folks mistrust the government, and the Tea Party is a manifestation of that in modern times today. Now, another important factor to remember in the oversight of the system are the individuals who actually provide the oversight. So the second bullet here identifies that population as public administrators. And Fessler refers to folks within organizations that have the primary responsibility to administer public programs within the guidelines and a policy established by a legislative body, and then providing those services in turn to the public as representatives of those bodies. Because when you think about it, you know, a legislative body is creating policy, but legislative bodies do not carry that policy out. There needs to be an administrative entity that actually does that. And so today we typically call that a public administrator. Now, a public administrator is an individual that is managing a program, and they have most likely been trained in the art of public administration. So they understand the various competing interests that they have to juggle in order to perform the service. But often, although this really shouldn't be the case, often public administrators also impose their own values upon the delivery of that service. Again, because they're individuals and they are human. And so Fessler refers to that as the view of bureaucrats, because you've got an individual who most likely is a career administrator. They have survived a number of legislative bodies and political oversight. They've most likely been in the system for a number of years. They may have been hired, for example, by a conservative legislative body or a conservative top administrator. But then they may have had to operate the service in times of conservation or in times of liberalism. And so they have to be able to balance those competing interests while at the same time remaining constant and steady in their provision of services. So, Fessler gives us a basic introduction into what is it that government does, and begins to identify some of these points within that presentation that affect the management and oversight of systems. And that includes mistrust, the individuals who administer the programs, and their particular point of view. So now let's depict this graphically for you. So we're going to take the components from the previous models that we've used now, where we had the 4 components, such as the private system, the public system, hospitals and corrections, and then the categories of relationships amongst those components, which we identified as formal, lay, folk, and social service relationships. And we're just going to pack those all in now to a single box, and we're going to label that box the mental health system. So today now we're talking about the management and oversight of that system, and so to graphically depict that, we're going to show that as a circle to the right of this box, and we're going to call it system oversight. So when we think of system oversight in this particular diagram, we've already discussed the public administrator. So there's an administrator in this circle to the right that's responsible for managing the program. And that administrator may be directly responsible to a particular level of government, such as they may be a county employee, so they're primarily responsible then to the county board of supervisors. However, in mental health, most of those services are coming down from the state and primarily federal government. So they're also representing the state and federal government as well. So there are levels of government within systems oversight. So the federal government, for example, we talk a lot about entitlements and what is an entitlement. An entitlement is something that is provided to the public. It is seen as a basic need. Therefore, it's always there and available to individuals who need it. So Social Security for individuals that pay into Social Security is an entitlement. The fact that you paid into that system, you ultimately will get something out of it. Food stamps or food security is a form of entitlement, because when we think about the basic needs of an individual, like if we're thinking of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for example, food and shelter and safety are some of the basic components that an individual needs to be in possession of before they can move up the hierarchy to other needs. In other words, without those basic components, they're unable to function on other levels. So the federal government is typically seen as the level of government that is primarily responsible for entitlement types of activities. So what's another real common activity that the federal government is responsible for? Well, how about defense? I mean, typically the federal government puts a significant amount of funding into defense, unlike any state or local government. In fact, local governments, really their only form of defense are their local police departments, so they don't necessarily have a military component. Some states do through the formation of the National Guard, but when you really think about it, most defense activities, Navy, Army, Marines, Air Force, those are all federal operations. Now, the other thing that the federal government does that the Founding Fathers assumed would be critically important, especially in comparison to other levels of government, is that the federal government would incur debt. And so this is a real timely discussion, because right now there's a huge federal deficit. Lots of talk about the federal deficit. And, and a lot of folks claim that the federal deficit has gotten a lot bigger under President Obama, primarily because of the stimulus packages that he implemented in order to prop up the economy. However, it's important to remember that the Founding Fathers envisioned that the federal government would be able to go into debt for that exact reason, that at times of economic insecurity, that the top level of government would be able to issue a significant amount of debt in order to keep the economy going. That was recognized from over 200 years ago. It still stands true today. Yet you hear a lot of talk in the presidential election, in the GOP nomination process. You hear a lot of talk about, well, we want a balanced budget amendment. And, that makes sense at a local and state level, but at the federal level, it really doesn't. And the reason for that is because that's the one level of government that was identified to be able to go into debt. And so if we eliminated the federal ability to go into debt by implementing a balanced budget amendment, we would significantly hamper the tools available to us to deal with economic difficulty and uncertainty. The Founding Fathers were actually very wise in this regard. Although the Federal Reserve was created later, the federal government has always recognized that role. And I think individuals that argue that the federal government needs to have a balanced budget and cannot incur debt is treading on, that's really treading on a very difficult situation. And if we were to go there, we would be really limited in our ability to respond to an economic downturn. And when you think about the amount of debt that the federal government incurs, it can actually encompass as much as 90% of the budget. Now that sounds crazy, and that just fundamentally sounds wrong, but with the way that our economic system operates, the investment of debt is necessary at the federal level because the ability of state and local government to do that is extremely limited. So the next level of government is the state government. And the state government provides some direct services, but primarily is either a pass-through for the federal government, administers federal funding, and basically does that in such a way that they manage what's provided at the local level. And the local level of government, out of all three levels of government, was primarily established as a direct service form of government. So when you really think about that, so think about the basics of local government, which are typically public safety like police and fire. At the state level, you do have the highway patrol. In California, we used to have state police, but they eliminated that and folded that into the highway patrol. But you really don't have other policing mechanisms. I mean, you do have a firefighting capacity at the state level through CAL FIRE, but that really was established as a wildland forest fire protection entity, not a direct service urban fire prevention entity, which it has slowly become. So the state government's kind of mostly this intermediary. They do some direct service provision. And when you think about the philosophy and the vision of Governor Jerry Brown, one of the things he keeps harping on is that things need to be local. There needs to be local control. Things need to be returned to the local government level of government. And in that regard, the governor recognizes that the state is simply not a good provider of direct service. They're just simply too big and too far away from the issue. And when you think about it, the federal government is even further from that. So the primary example of a direct provision of service by the federal government is the Veterans Administration. And when you sit back and you think about what the Veterans Administration is, it is this parallel, standalone system of care that replicates every other form of care available in society and dedicates it solely to veterans. So once upon a time, that was probably a valid way of providing service. But when you think about moving forward and you think about healthcare reform and that type of thing, is really a standalone national system the best approach to have when we're trying to contain and control costs, provide seamless forms of service delivery, and managing our resources to the best of our ability? So the answer to that is probably no. Typically, at the state level as well, we see a lot of involvement in education, welfare, roads, infrastructure, and trusts. And when I say trusts, I'm talking about retirement. So for example, if you use your degree to enter into a public community mental health system and you work for a government entity, so let's say you go to work for the county providing mental health, one of the benefits that you will receive is a retirement pension. And in California, the state actually manages all of the retirement pensions for all public employees, regardless of the level at which they serve. And here in California, that's called PERS, Public Employee Retirement System, and specifically in California, it's called CalPERS. And that's a state responsibility and function, but is provided to all levels of government. And as mentioned before, typically what the state does is they really do act as this intermediary for the federal government. They will receive federal dollars and then in turn administer those for either state agencies or more likely for local government entities. Because when you think about it, what would the federal government rather do? Would they rather deal with the states, or would they rather deal with a couple thousand local entities? And the answer to that is the federal government wants to constrain their scope of work and their scope of practice, and so they're just going to want to deal with states. They're not going to want to deal with all 58 California counties when they can just deal with one state entity. Now, when we talk about local government, there's lots of forms of local government. The primary one is a county. So there are 58 counties in the state of California. And when you think about a county, what a county is, it's a political subdivision of the state of California. So what does that mean? What that means is that when the state of California was established, it was recognized that the state really wouldn't be in a position to be able to provide services from one end of the state or the other. So it created these areas of service, or political subdivisions, known as counties. Now, counties are government unto themselves. They have their own policy decision-making body or legislative body, commonly known as a board of supervisors, and they do have autonomy and authority. But a lot of what makes up a county budget is pass-through of state and federal dollars, primarily through the state of California. So when we talk about how much discretionary funding a board of supervisors has authority over, it's typically very limited. And what we mean by that is discretionary funding that's not tied to some type of funding source requirement or comes with strings, that type of thing. So for example, if a county was to receive funding for CalWORKs, for public assistance, there's a whole set of regulations on how CalWORKs is to be administered, and the expectation is that the funding provided to the county by the state and federal government for CalWORKs will be spent in accordance with CalWORKs regulations and requirements. You can't take the CalWORKs dollars and go spend them on the sheriff's office. But what boards of supervisors do have available to them as discretionary is what we call general fund. So when you think about the various funding sources that make up a county budget, a preponderance of those are going to be state and federal funding streams, but some of it's going to be funding from local taxation, primarily property tax, that generates revenue for the county, and that's general revenue. And what we mean by general is that it's not specific to anything, and therefore the Board of Supervisors have authority to spend that as they see fit. Typically, the preponderance of it is spent on law enforcement, such as the sheriff's office, the jail, probation, and the district attorney. Now, there are other forms of local government, and that includes cities and towns and townships, and each of those is a little bit more detailed as you walk across the spectrum. So a city, for example, is going to have a lot of autonomy and a lot of authority, and you have charter cities and general law cities. So a charter city's got a little bit more autonomy than a general law. What that means is, under general law, the city was formed by the state of California or the county. A charter city was formed by a vote of the people. So people in a particular geographical area got together and said that they wanted to form a city, and they put it to a vote, and what they adopted on the ballot is what's called a charter. And the charter is best construed as a mini constitution. So take the city of Chico, for example. The city of Chico is a charter city. It is not a general law city. So there is some autonomy that the city of Chico has from the state of California, because when it was created under a charter. And the charter gives the city certain authorities that the voters approved. So, for example, in the city of Chico, the voters gave the Chico City Council the authority to create certain commissions and boards, such as a planning commission, in order to create a body that oversees land use decisions. And that's in the charter. If it wasn't in the charter, or the city was a general law city, they would still have the authority to have a planning commission, but there would be less autonomy because it would have to be done in conformance with state requirements rather than the authority given directly to the city by the voters when the charter was adopted. And then as we kind of go down the scale there to towns and townships, it's basically a looser form of government. So a town is most likely not going to be charter, and it's going to be loosely affiliated. A township is most likely not even an incorporated area of local government. They may not have an official legislative body, and instead they might have an advisory body to a higher level of government that has authority over that township. And then when you think about all of the entities that make up local government, about half of those entities are actually special districts. And so what a special district is, it's a form of government that's been created to provide a specific service that was needed. So this is the most common basic form of government in which individuals in a particular geographical location decide to get together and create a public entity in order to meet a common goal. So a good example of that is the provision of water. So a neighborhood may decide, rather than each property having its own individual water well, that they wanted to create one community well. and then they decide to create a geographical district that well serves, and everybody that is served by that well pays into the maintenance and operation of that well. So that is an example of a special district. Specifically in this example, that would be a water district. So special districts have a number of latent powers, or powers that are afforded to them at the time that they are created. Those typically are things like water, sewer, electricity, fuel, fire, and safety. And when you think about the three levels of government, federal, state, and local, as I mentioned before, really local government is best poised to provide goods and services to the public. In fact, when you really think about the formation of government, local government really is singularly devoted to the provision of services, unlike the other two levels of government, which have a tendency to pass dollars on to lower levels of government and then administer and manage those dollars over that government entity. Whereas in local government, it's primarily provision of services. And when you see services being directly provided by the other levels of government, that has typically led to problems. Finance problems, capacity problems, deficit problems, that type of thing. So it's pretty true and tried and pretty well accepted that the best place for the direct provision of services is at the local level. Okay, so now let's impose this graphically on this system that we're slowly building. Alright, so we've got these three levels of government. Each provides direct authority to the system. So we've got our system, and we've identified that as all of the other components that we've talked about previously, all falling into this one box. Then we add it to that, the administration of that system. And what we've further defined today is that administrative activities over that system can be federally, state, or locally driven. And how does that occur? So at the federal level, we have Congress, we have the House of Representatives, and the Senate, who pass policy. They also allocate funding. So through their policy making and allocation of funding, they're providing direct authority to the administration of the system to do certain things. And then the state level of authority is represented by the legislature, and the legislature is typically comprised of a House of the Assembly and a House of the Senate. And in the legislature, they may actually be creating state policy that directly affects the provision of services, and then they may also be allocating funding that drives certain services. So they may, for using a real-time example, the state of California is in the process of bifurcating CalWORKs. So CalWORKs is a time-limited public assistance program. You cannot stay on it for life anymore. You can only stay on it for a number of years. A couple years back, California made that 48 months. After 48 months of public assistance, if you have not found a job and weaned yourself off of the public dole, your aid stops. And what the current proposal in Sacramento is to bifurcate that further, and they're talking about CalWORKs Basic and CalWORKs Plus. CalWORKs Basic is 24 months of service. If at the end of that 24 months you have actively participated in work activities, in other words, you're moving towards employment, then you get to move into CalWORKs Plus, which is another 24 months of service, thus the whole 48 months, as was delineated in earlier policy. However, if at the end of the first 24 months you have not been participating in training and work activities, and you have not been moving towards employment, then you would no longer be entitled to the second 24 months of aid. In other words, after that first 24 months, you are cut off. Unless you have children in your family, then there would be some form of aid that would continue to come, but it would be just calculated for the needs of the children, not for the adults. And then local government authority in this particular diagram is depicted by the Board of Supervisors. So the Board of Supervisors are the local legislative body at the county level that are responsible for establishing local policy and local budget allocations. So it's very important now that you become familiar with the model that's in front of you, because this basically now represents the core of what this class is all about. Because in order to do sufficient and adequate policy analysis, we need to know the components that make up the system that develops and implements the policy. And so what you have in front of you now is a basic model that represents that. And this is a model that the entire class is situated upon. This is the foundation for everything that we will learn in this course. All right, so remember that very clearly. You have a system. You have a system that is administered, and then that administration is influenced by levels of government. Now, we will expand this model slightly to incorporate other types of things that influence the model, such as voters and consumers. And when you think about that administrative bubble in the middle of this diagram, there are a lot of other things that influence that administration. So for example, there may be audits and regulatory reviews. So there might be agencies within the various levels of government, both Congress and the legislature, both federal and state, that are going to come in and take a look at the administrative activities to make sure that they're compliant with program requirements. Okay, so typically that's an audit. It could be a program audit where they're simply looking to make sure the program is being provided in the proper way, or it could be a financial audit to make sure that the funding that is allocated to the system is being administered correctly. In other words, the dollar was spent for the right type of service, the dollar wasn't spent on something that had nothing to do with the program. So let's talk about the tools of government. So the way that various levels of government affect system oversight is by using a series of tools, which you can see as depicted here. Now the first one is direct administration, and we've talked a little bit about this already, in that what level of government is best at providing direct service, and we've talked about the local level of government actually being the best level of government for direct service provision. In fact, that is the nexus, that is the core of what local government's all about. And there are many examples of when we see direct services provided by the state or federal government that over time become difficult to administer. They either become too costly, or they're ineffective, or both. Grants are obviously the granting of funding between various levels of government. So for example, in 2014, healthcare reform will kick in. There will be an expansion of Medicaid. More people will be covered for health insurance that have never been covered before. So where I work in Glenn County, we've been trying to prepare for healthcare reform. And one of the preparatory activities that we've embarked on is the integration of primary care services and mental health services. And so what we're actually doing is we're bringing primary care into the mental health clinic. So a typical integration strategy is you bring behavioral health into the primary care clinic, but we're actually doing the opposite model, where we're bringing primary care into the existing mental health clinic. So in order to be able to do that, we wrote a federal grant to SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. So it's a federal agency that was allocated funding under the Affordable Care Act, or more commonly known as Obamacare, for demonstration models related to healthcare reform implementation. So we wrote a grant, and we were approved for the grant, and were provided X numbers of dollars for each year for a period of 5 years. So we really saw that as the bridge from where we were to where we needed to be in 2014. Now the grant, when it was awarded to us, came with specific requirements on how the money is to be spent, what the milestones are, the particular outcomes, the goals that need to be accomplished, and then we're monitored on a regular basis to make sure we're achieving those outcomes and goals. So for example, one goal was to serve 63 people per year under this new grant program. And we've been at it for a little over a year, and we didn't achieve 63 in the first year. We achieved 40. So we fell 23 short. So then the grant monitor comes and talks to us and says, well, what's the strategy to getting back on track? Because if you don't get back on track, you're not in compliance with the grant, and we'll have to either take the grant away or reduce it accordingly. So grants are a way to move money between various levels of government for a specific activity, primarily used as a carrot on a stick to get other levels of government to behave in a certain way that is desirable. So the next one is contracts, and a really good example of a contract is the contract between the MHP, what we call the mental health plan. Just think of that as local county specialty mental health. In the bureaucratic world, we call that an MHP, mental health plan. What that means is that the local county specialty mental health program is really a managed care plan within the county. It's like its own insurance company, but in this case it's mostly Medi-Cal, right? Maybe a little bit of Healthy Families in there and that type of thing. But anyway, there's a contract that exists between the county and the state on how specialty mental health is to be provided. And there's a couple ways that occurs. So there's this one thing called the MHP contract, the mental health plan contract, which is essentially, it's a performance contract. It's not necessarily a monetary contract. In other words, the typical contract, I promise to do this, you promise to do that, you get paid this, I get paid that, we sign it, we're hunky-dory. But in a performance contract, what we're really talking about is this is the expectation of how this program is to be performed at the local level. And this contract essentially dictates the way in which that will be done. And by signing this contract, you agree to deliver the services this way and to perform the function this way. And if you don't do that, then we might make a finding against you, which could lead to taking the program away, recouping dollars, and that type of things. Contracting also is a form of privatization, because we have, so for example, at the local level we've got organizational providers, so private entities that are providing care on our behalf. So the prime example in Butte County and in Shasta County is North Valley Catholic Social Service. So North Valley Catholic Social Service is a private faith-based entity, but they do a lot of provision of Medi-Cal services, and they do that as an organizational provider to the county. So the county has a contract with them to provide services that would otherwise be provided by county employees, right? So one of the reasons that we do that is to control costs, because we can actually put into the contract, you will serve X number of people and we will pay you X number of dollars, rather than just hiring a cadre of employees that are always going to have a cost to you, regardless of whether or not they're delivering a service. In fact, all of you know very well, the more productive an individual is in the Medi-Cal program, the more revenue that they generate for the organization. So contracts with organizational providers are a way to control costs. Costs by limiting what can be spent on a specific program for a specific population. But the other thing that it does is it controls the costs associated with personnel, right? Because we don't have all these staff. And if the workload declines, then we just shrink the contract. If we had county staff doing all of the work and the workload declined, then we'd have to lay people off. And then some administrators also see contracting with organizational providers as a way to control liability. Because since the service is not being provided directly by them, it creates this additional hurdle. Should something go wrong and an individual sues, obviously they're going to be suing the organizational provider directly, and there's some limit of liability against the main contractor, the county, in this instance. In fact, the contracts with organizational providers actually have sections in them that speak directly to this, that limit the liability of the county. So contracts are a tool of government to control, that are used to control how the system works. Next is regulations, and really, regulations. Just think about regulation as an imposition of power upon a level of government with no funding, right? Because almost everything else we've talked about in these bullets above regulations involve money. And typically we're dangling money on the end of a stick in order to get somebody to behave in a certain way, right? But regulations were forcing an entity to behave in a certain way regardless of whether or not there's funding and allocation or any spending going on. So regulations are typically born out of or emerge from law. So think about those policy-making bodies, those legislative bodies. Okay, so we've got Congress, we have the legislature, and we have the Board of Supervisors, and they actually create law. And then the implementing agencies, think about that administrative bubble. Obviously there are entities at each level of government that are responsible for carrying out the policy of the legislative body. And typically what these agencies do is they create regulations, and the regulations are supported by the law. All right, so the law may say that nobody can drive a car on Sunday, so that's the law. But how do we implement that out in the community? And the way that we're going to implement that is regulatory. So what the regulation may say, an individual caught driving a car on Sunday is subject to a fine. Okay, pretty bad example, but that's all I can think of at this particular time. So anyway, regulations pretty much speak for themselves. We're all very familiar with that. Just really think about it as power with no money. So the next one is tax expenditures, and tax expenditures has become a significant tool of government in order to get certain things to occur. So the most common one, the easiest one to think about, is economic development, for example. So if we wanted a big company to move into Bernie, one of the things that we might do is give them some free land. All right. And then they might take possession of that land, and when anybody takes possession of land, they're then subject to property taxation. So what we might do is say, okay, because you're going to locate here and you're going to provide X number of jobs, and we really need this and we really want this, we're going to forgive your property tax for the first 10 years. Okay, so there's a tax incentive to get that business to locate there. So typically in taxation as a form of oversight, We see things like tax deductions, tax credits, tax relief. In other words, once again, we're using money to influence behavior. So let me give you another example. When hybrid cars first started, the federal government provided a tax credit to individuals who purchased a hybrid car, and they were able to deduct that from their federal tax return. So that was like getting a rebate from the car dealership, but in this instance it was applicable to your tax return, not to the actual purchase price of the car. Because when hybrids first came out, and this relatively still stands true today, they were very expensive. Now the prices kind of come down. Think about, calculators. Well, some of you, well, actually most of you in this course are probably old enough to remember this, but think about when calculators first came out. They were big, they were bulky, and they were expensive. Now they're given to you as a free gift when you walk by a booth at a vendor fair. They've become almost like second nature, right? So same thing with various tax incentives. We're trying to get people to behave in a certain way in order to accomplish things by affecting the level of tax that they pay. And then the last one on this list is loan programs. And really, when we talk about loan programs, really what we're saying here, what Fessler's really saying, is that it's just kind of a charade, in that we will represent a particular funding allocation as a loan in order to make it more palatable. In other words, we're not simply giving money away. There's an expectation that that money will be returned, so therefore it's really not a true expenditure. It's just a temporary use of the dollars. So we're not really losing the dollars, because we'll eventually get them back. So we haven't really expended them per se. We've just temporarily taken them out of use. So loan programs really have become a facade by legislative bodies in order to make their decisions more palatable. So let me give you a couple examples of that. So I created a domestic violence service shelter in Glenn County recently. So the Board of Supervisors said, we want a domestic violence shelter in Glenn County. Now, my response back to that was, well, don't you think we ought to have service capacity first? Because we rely on Catalyst out of Chico to help us with that, but we have no true in-county entity capable of providing domestic violence services. So wouldn't you think that the appropriate first step would be to develop that capacity within the community, and then look at potentially sheltering? Well, so my board was very, they're the decision makers, they're the legislative body, they directed me to create a domestic violence shelter, which we did. And the way that we did that was we went to the state of California and we got an emergency housing assistance program capital development loan. All right, so we got $550,000 from the state of California in the middle of the biggest recession, when the state of California is running a giant deficit. And how did we get that? Because it's actually a loan. It's currently on the books as a loan, so the funding has been temporarily shifted from the state to the local government in order to purchase a domestic violence shelter. And what we did was we went out and we purchased 5 acres with a bunch of structures on it, and we're in the process of rehabilitating it. And here's the kicker: as long as that property continues as a domestic violence service for a period of 10 years, at the end of the 10 years, the loan is forgivable. So it's money with strings, and it's not an outright allocation. Because if during that 10 years the shelter closes, we stop using it as a domestic violence shelter, now that loan is due. All right, so 2 things were accomplished here. We had money made available to us for a specific activity that the California legislature has identified as a priority. And then they made that allocation more palatable by packaging it as a loan rather than just an outright grant. So let's take a little break and have some fun, and here's an example of direct democracy.
Oh, we're having an election, November 2's the day. There are 9 state propositions, come vote and have your say. Prop 19's the first measure, it asks voters if we oughta
regulate, tax, and legalize marijuana.
Each 10 years congressional district lines get redrawn.
Prop 20 says that job should go to a citizens commission.
Prop 21 would fund state parks with automobile fees.
Prop 22 curbs state access to local government proceeds.
It's the proposition song, let's all be singing along, 'cause the ballot is too darn long. 23 suspends a law called AB 32
that seeks to slow down climate change and restricts what polluters do.
If voters pass Prop 2332, it would prevent
from being law till unemployment's at 5.5%.
The next prop also seeks to keep a law from taking effect. 24 would halt newly enacted corporate tax credits. There are just a few more measures to sing of in this song.
So hang on, friends, we're near the end
of this proposition song. You should all be singing along, 'cause the ballot is too darn long. Passing the state budget takes a 2/3 vote currently.
Prop 25 would change it to a straight majority.
26 is also about vote margins, switching up the words. Instead of majorities to pass new fees,
The vote would be 2/3.
27's yet another prop about political district lines.
If it's passed, the job goes to the politicians next time.
If you want more information, just log yourself online.
There's a whole lot more at calvoter.org.
We're open all the time.
So let's turn our attention to a much more interesting form of system oversight, and this is called direct democracy. So you had a chapter from Cronin that you had to read in this weekly unit. It's a fairly old book, so I apologize for that, but it's just, this type of stuff really hasn't changed over time. These are very basic activities that were created by the electorate in order for them to have direct authority over their representatives for when their representatives fail to represent them well. So we, in the United States, use a form of government called representative. So what does representative mean? It means that we've got somebody representing us in the decision-making process. All right? So we're not a true democracy or a pure democracy in sense of the word. In other words, we do not vote on everything that comes in front of the government as a group of voters, right? We elect somebody to represent us and make those decisions on our behalf, and then from time to time we either re-elect them or we replace them. So that's called representative government. You go back to the Boston Tea Party, right? Taxation without representation. You remember tea was being taxed by royalty, right? By a form of government located overseas for which none of the members of the colonies had representation in. So taxation was being imposed upon the colonies without them directly participating in the decision-making process, right? Because they were a colony. That was colonization. That wasn't representative government. That certainly wasn't a democracy, and that was why our democracy was born out of that, because of the need for that type of thing. Now, you think about the Swiss. the Swiss have a form of government similar to ours, but most of the decisions that are made by the legislative body are also put in front of the voters for confirmation. All right, so they're a little bit closer to being a pure form of democracy than we are, because they don't wholesale the decision-making process to the representatives. They keep them in check. So Cronin argues that really ultimately people should author their own laws, and when they don't, or when they have a representative form of government, they lose some of their freedom, right? Because they're not making the decision themselves. They've vested that in someone to make the decision on their behalf. So we hear about politicians that are out of touch, and what we mean by that is they're making decisions that really don't reflect the way that we feel, or perhaps really don't reflect the way that we live. So we lose a little bit of freedom of that. That's why you hear the cliche, all politics are local, because when you think about those various forms of government, federal, state, and local government provides the greatest opportunity for you to interface in the decision-making process, right? Every other week, the legislative body gathers in the center of your town. It's open. You can come down and speak. California legislature is similar, but you got to wait for a hearing. You've got to know when that hearing is. You got to travel down to Sacramento, and when you participate in a hearing, you're most likely there with dozens, if not hundreds, of other people. And even then, you're always testifying before a subset of the entire legislative body. In other words, you're testifying at a committee, like a committee on Health and Human Services or a committee on budget. You're not actually testifying in front of the entire legislature. In fact, you can't. There is no way for you to testify in front of the entire decision-making body. You can only testify to subsets of that body. And when you go into the Assembly or the Senate, you can only sit there and watch. It is rare that a member of public would get to stand up and address the entire body. It just doesn't happen that way. So as you move up these levels of government, the decision making becomes more distant. So these are some of the deficiencies in representative government. Now, over time, these deficiencies in representative government have caused great harm to the people, to the extent that the people did something about it. So here in California, in the 1800s, when California was developing, the railroads were king. So everything was all about building railroads in California, which meant having to acquire a significant amount of land for the railroad right-of-way and associated facilities for the railroad, which means a lot of people had land taken from them, or perhaps that land was bought but at a significant undervalued price. So people were being harmed by the railroad company. And one of the reasons the railroad company was able to do this is because corruption and graft in the California legislature was out of control. In fact, most of the members of the California legislature had ties to the railroad company. So the railroad company had its fingers in the legislative body and the decision-making process, and ultimately had control over that, right? Yet those individuals were placed there to be the representative of the public, not a representative of the railroad company. So decisions were being made in the California legislature that directly harmed the electorate. So they did something about it. And in California, we created 3 forms of direct democracy. And those include referendum, recall, and initiative. So a referendum is a decision is made by the legislative body, and we decide as a group of voters we don't like that. So we do a referendum petition, and we get enough voters to sign a petition that says, we disagree with the ultimate decision that was made, and we think it should be put to the vote of the public. All right, so the referendum is one form of direct democracy that keeps our legislators in touch with the people. Now, recall is a tool that's also related to the politician in that if you're dissatisfied with the decisions that they're making, you can prematurely remove them from office rather than having to wait to the next election cycle. I mean, when you really think about elections, I mean, really what elections are is they're a revolution. Every election is a revolution because we're either okay with the people who are representing us or we're throwing them out. So there are these political battles that occur from time to time in every election. I mean, elections really are battles. They really are war. They're political war about who is appropriate to represent everyone else and who isn't, or who hasn't represented us well and should be removed. So the recall was a tool instituted in the state of California by the electorate to be able to prematurely remove somebody from office who in the eyes of the voters has failed the public. So those first two, referendum and recall, directly relate to keeping politicians in touch with the people, keeping them honest, keeping them on track. Because the threat of referendum and recall cause politicians pause in their decision-making process. That, you know, if I pick answer A, what effect will that have on the voters? In fact, I once studied under this guy, Marty Lewinsky, who was in the Massachusetts House of Commons, and he wrote a book called Leadership on the Line. And I studied under him when I first became an elected official, and there are three things that he talks about, and one of those three things is this: leadership is disappointing people at the rate at which they can absorb. Leadership is disappointing people at the rate at which they can absorb. So decision makers in most instances will never be able to make a decision that makes everybody happy. In fact, if everybody's happy, there probably wasn't a decision that needed to be made, right? Because when we make a decision, typically there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers. And if everybody leaves the hearing dissatisfied, then something probably went well because nobody got everything that they wanted and nobody got nothing. I mean, if everybody's disappointed, something may have gone right. And so when we think about disappointing people at the rate that they can absorb, that is the threshold that the voters hold the politician against. If we do something so egregious that we irritate the electorate to the point that they take action, then clearly we're disappointing them beyond the rate at which they can absorb. But if we make a decision and they go, I can live with that, or, you know, that's not good, but it doesn't affect me enough to have to do something about it. All right, so that's leadership, and that's disappointing people at the rate that they can absorb. Now, the initiative is a little bit different than the first two, because the initiative may not necessarily be in response to what a legislative body's done. It's actually in response to what a legislative body hasn't done. In other words, the initiative is a tool by which the electorate can directly legislate themselves. So in California, that's commonly known as a proposition. So there will be a series of propositions on the ballot. Many of those propositions arrived there through petition, meaning someone decided to create an initiative, go out and get a sufficient number of signatures, have those signatures validated, and have the question put on the ballot. Sometimes propositions on the ballot are initiated by the legislature. They get to the point where they've decided that they truly, as a legislative body, cannot make the decision by themselves and would rather have the voters weigh in on that. So right now in California, the prime example of that is Governor Brown's desire to extend certain forms of taxes in an effort to balance the budget by using both revenues and cuts. Now, clearly, the legislature over the last year and a half has been unwilling to extend those taxes themselves. In fact, the legislature has been unwilling to even put the question in front of the public. I mean, really, it's come down to, wool-coat conservatives not even wanting the public to have an opportunity to decide about taxes because they're so anti-tax, they're not even going to allow the question to appear on the ballot. So what Governor Brown has done is he's created his own proposition that will end up on the ballot, and he will directly ask the public to make that decision since the legislature will not make it. Now, the initiative process has been really good over the years, but more recently it's become really interesting because a number of initiatives have been ending up on the ballot that really have more to do with special interests or corporate interests. And in other words, although this truly is a pure form of democracy, it's a form of democracy that is costly because you have a certain amount of time in which to collect a certain number of signatures, and that takes money to do. And if you fail to collect significant signatures, you're not going to end up on the ballot. So a lot of questions end up on the ballot that really aren't voter driven. They're more company driven. So a couple years back, there was a question on the ballot that was put there by PG&E about bond financing and limiting the ability of local government to be able to issue bonds for them to develop their own electrical systems. So take Reading, for example. The city of Reading has its own municipal power company. They buy power from PG&E and other power providers, but the actual transmission of the electricity within the city limits is conducted by the city of Reading itself. So if the city of Reading wanted to improve, update, or expand their electrical system, they would typically do that by issuing a bond. So the voters have to approve a bond where they go out and they borrow money and pay it back over time in order to accomplish the upgrade project, right? So PG&E had put a proposition on the ballot that limited local government's ability to bond for electrical systems. And it was a blatant move by PG&E to actually limit municipal power companies from growing. So what their goal was to do in municipal power companies and get rid of them so that PG&E could take over that part of the market and have full control of the provision of electricity within the city of Reading. So that's one small example of how the initiative process, as grand and as great as it was envisioned to be, over time has really become susceptible to things and ideas and suggestions that really aren't voter or electorate driven. They're really more about a company wanting to get something done because they can't convince the legislative body to do it otherwise, right? And in this case, PG&E had tons of money. I mean, they outspent the opposition like 100,000 to 1 or something. I think in the end, don't quote me on this, but I think in the end they had spent $23 million on their proposition, and the opposition spent less than $1 million. And it failed because ultimately people were able to see through it. So the initiative really has its roots in the populist movement, right? With what we mean is really the farming community. So Cronin talks a little bit about the history of that. So these forms of direct democracy have had a lot of benefit over time in history. I mean, for example, you think about women's suffrage and the right of women to be able to vote. While not one of these individual tools was used to legislate that, it was a groundswell community-based approach that ultimately convinced the legislative bodies that this was the appropriate action to take. Prohibition was another example where prohibitionists were able to have their values imposed upon society using the political system and limiting the availability and production of alcohol, but ultimately it was the uprising of people that were able to turn that around and turn it over. So direct democracy clearly is a form of politics. It's ultimately bad for representative government because a lot of people see representative government as a weaker form of democracy. But this is direct democracy is really a cool and a wonderful thing. It really can redeem legislatures. In other words, it's a way to limit the boss. The boss control. I mean, you think of the decades ago. You think about the city of Chicago and Mayor Daley, and he had a political machine that everybody complied with, and it got to the point where people rebelled against that, and they used forms of direct democracy to do that. So direct democracy has the ability to control special interests and control corruption, although lately we see special interests using these tools to their own benefit. Now, some people worry about direct democracy because they really feel that the electorate's not smart enough to make their own decisions, right? That representative government is better because we get really smart individuals into the legislative body who are more apt and able to make good decisions, right? Usually, although it seems like everybody who becomes a politician ends up becoming a dumbass right off the bat, right? But so there's that concern. And then, a concern I personally have through the initiative process is that the law is very clear that a proposition has to be a single issue item. You can't, have 3 different questions rolled up into one. There really needs to be just one issue so that it's simple, it's clear to the electorate, they know what they're voting on. But how common is it for us to have more than one proposition on the ballot that is in conflict with the other, like it may cancel out the other? So recently there were 2 examples of that. There were 2 redistricting propositions on the ballot. One would do away with redistricting commissions. The other one would strengthen them. If they both passed, we would have had a significant conflict there that would have to be worked out by the courts, and then in that instance, the will of the voters may not actually ever be achieved. Another example of that was the budget authority. So on the last ballot in California, voters were given the opportunity to change the 2/3 voting requirement on passing the budget in California to a simple majority. It passed, but then there was another proposition that said any new forms of revenue require a 2/3 vote. So those were conflicting propositions. They both passed, and one weakened the other. So there's those types of conflicts that occur. And then there's just this other issue that's very clear to me, that over time you've got propositions that conflict with one another, but they've been put into place over time, perhaps not on the same ballot. In other words, does the voter really have the total big picture when they're passing something? And do they remember something that they passed before that this would affect, or do they know that something they'll pass in the future will have an effect on it as well? So there's that whole institutional memory that just cannot be maintained very well in an initiative process. Ultimately, all of these types of tools of direct democracy have really come out of major economic change. The railroads, that was a major economic change in order to break the corruption of the railroad companies in California. And where do we find ourselves today? Today we find the Occupy movements. We've got an anti-corporate feeling emerging within the populace. We're in the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. So once again, the stars are aligning for something to change in the political process in order to correct the problems that we have today. What will that be? I do not know. But one thing I can tell you is all of these forms of direct democracy occur at the state and local level, and not in all states. But none of them occur at the national level. None of these forms of direct democracy occur on the national scene. So one could speculate that the potential change politically that could occur is to allow for greater forms of direct democracy over the federal government. And then to kind of wrap this whole section up, based on some of the problems that we've identified associated with all of these tools, it's clearly this is not a substitute for representative government. Representative government still works well. It works best for our type of society. But what we've done is we've put checks and balances in place to assure that representative government remains fair and sound. So the last layer of systems oversight that I would like to add to the puzzle, we've spent the last half hour talking about voters and the tools that voters have available to themselves. But transformation has recently occurred in the state of California through the passage of Prop 63, more commonly known as the Mental Health Services Act. And one of the things that the Mental Health Services Act did was impose this notion of consumer involvement in the system. So there's this slogan out there, nothing about us without us. That was a slogan of many consumer organizations during the election in which Prop 63 appeared on the ballot. And that why would we manage and administer systems without knowing what it is that the people who are affected by that system want, what they need, what they perceive to be happening, the feedback that they have on whether the system works or not. I mean, who better to communicate that than the end user? So Prop 63 has really transformed the mental health system to incorporate consumer involvement. And we hear catchphrases such as consumer-centered or patient-centered or client-centered, consumer-driven, and consumer-managed. And so ultimately what that means is the decisions around treatment and care directly involve the person who is receiving that treatment and care. Those decisions aren't made absent of them. I mean, it wasn't very long ago that treatment plans were created with very little input from the consumer or the client. I mean, they were tested, they were assessed, but very little dialogue around would you rather have this or would you rather have that. It was just decided that you have a disease and this is the standard treatment for that disease, so this is what you're going to get. And now we really don't see mental health systems as just a treatment of a disease. It's more about wellness and recovery, which means we're taking a holistic look at everything in a consumer's environment that is going to affect their illness. I mean, you go back to our discussion about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We can treat a consumer for a mental illness until the cows come home, but if they're homeless, the effectiveness of our treatment, our ability to manage their medications is going to be extremely limited. And so if we're focusing on meeting their housing needs and their food needs and their employment needs on top of their treatment needs, there's more likely going to be a chance of success. And these needs are identified by the consumer themselves. We're not sending them from door to door to get these. We're coordinating these services for them. And so that's consumer-centered. Consumer-driven and managed is that the actual provision of the services, how the services are provided, where they're provided, and when they're provided, is actually decided by the end user themselves. And in many instances, they're directly involved with the delivery of service. So for example, it is very common in county specialty mental health clinics today to have a number of the employees working there actually having been consumers themselves or consumers currently themselves. In fact, to give you an example, in Glenn County, about 20% of the behavioral health staff are consumers. They've actually have lived experience around mental illness, and now they're directly involved with the provision of services. In fact, when we're audited for performance by the state of California and the federal government, one of the things that is looked at closely is how far up the chain of command are consumers involved with decisions. And the Mental Health Services Act and the implementing regulation that followed it, and ultimately the people who audit that regulation, have found that executive level decisions require consumer input. So for example, me as a mental health director, one of the common practices that I have is before I make a big decision, I check in with a group of consumers to make sure that's okay. Now that might occur through the Mental Health Advisory Board or Commission, but it also could occur through a focus group or a committee of consumers. In fact, one of the things I actually do is I have this thing called MELT, which is the MHSA Executive Leadership Team. So that would typically be the director and the deputy directors and some managers, right? And that is the way that it is, but there's also a group of consumers, and we make no final decision without the consumer involvement. So this imposes kind of a new piece on the system's oversight as a result of Prop 63, that consumers are directly involved with the oversight of the system. So let's now depict this visually. So we've got this model that we've been building, and now we're going to expand on that, and this will make the model complete. So we have the mental health system that we started talking about in the first weekly unit, and all of those different boxes were rolled up into one box known as the system. And then we imposed an administrative oversight for that system, and that administration is influenced by federal, state, and local. And administration is given authority. So when we think about oversight, think about authority. And what authority means is, what authority do you have to do this or to do that? Did you, as a department head, make a decision for which you have no authority? And if you did, then the decision is invalid. You may only make decisions for those areas in which you have authority. And authority is delegated to the administrator by law or by policy, which is created by the various levels of government. So now we have a complete model that becomes the foundation for the entire course. So administration of the system is directly affected by policy developed at the state, federal, and local level, or Congress, legislature, and board of supervisors, but also because of direct democracy and because of the Mental Health Services Act, both voters and consumers also now have the ability to impose authority upon the administration and oversight of the system. So this is a little ways out, but you will have completed assignment 1 as part of this weekly unit 2, and assignment 1 is the topic for your policy analysis. Assignment 2 is going to be the policy analysis outline, and there are a couple Schmidt chapters dedicated to that. You'll see them in assignment 2. Those chapters are fairly clear on what an outline should look like and what goes into an outline. And so as you prepare for that outline, for that assignment, here are some things to think about. So take your topic and think about the topic. You know, what are the arguments around your particular issue? You know, why is there a need for a policy? What does the policy set out to do? Did the policy achieve what it set out to do? All right, so we just created 3 argument areas, and then we begin to do research, whether it's scholarly research, looking at articles, looking at textbooks, looking at databases, and we begin to find evidence that either supports or refutes those arguments. And then we organize all of those arguments and piece of evidence into various groupings, and that becomes the basis for our outline. So when you get into the module where assignment 2 is, there's a lot more detail around this, and the Schmidt chapters specifically provide you direction on how to do this. Now again, we're breaking up the policy analysis work in this class into 4 components. So you're building towards writing a major paper. So by now, your topic has been selected. I have most likely by now given you feedback on that topic. We've honed it down into something you're actually going to analyze, and now it's time to start thinking about what does that look like. And the sooner that you do that, the better off that you will be. I've seen so many students stress over the paper, but really even the people who are the most stressed about the paper are usually always right on track. The key is when you get on track and how you manage your time and allocate your time towards these various assignments. If you let it all build towards the end of the semester, then yeah, you're going to have a difficult time and your paper will probably not turn out the way that you want it to. The other reason why getting going on the outline is critical is because during one of our face-to-face meetings in Reading, you're actually going to do a short PowerPoint presentation on your policy analysis to the rest of the class, and this is critically important. Don't stress out about it. It's not that big of a deal. It's actually fun. See it as an opportunity to teach your classmates about a particular subject that's important to you and ultimately important to them and could affect their career. So for example, I always have somebody that writes about TerraSoft. You know, what is TerraSoft? How did it come to be? Why did it come to be? You know, what levels or variations of TerraSoft are there? Why? How do we actually implement TerraSoft in our practice? What are some of the ethical and liability questions around TerraSoft? So TerraSoft, you know, a great topic, and by the time someone begins to do some basic analysis around that, there's great information that can be shared with your classmates that will forever be useful in their careers. So to summarize this lecture, we went back and we took a short look at mental health systems and the relationships within those systems. But then we spent a preponderance of this lecture talking about oversight, the various levels of government and voters and consumers and their influence on the administration of the mental health system. And we created that model that is now the foundation to the entire course and the model by which we will use in our policy analysis. Thank you.